All right, it's a little bit early, but we thought, hey, everybody's here. You guys want to get started? Cool. Welcome to our 2022 clinics. My name's Jerry. I have to tell you that because I forgot my badge. It's in my truck. The one that usually tows the trailer. So I change vehicles. I forget them. I might have to get another badge and put it in my other car. Okay, Bob?
All right. You think you're up, Bob? Or thank you.
Alrighty, so I'm the other half of the cannery train crew, and all of our stuff down there is track powered. You probably picked that up from JT's presentation, and a lot of the folks in the club, you're running battery power, but so track power is kind of a whole different thing. My layout that I had up in Linwood was all track power. And you know the challenges of having it outside and everything. So inside is a whole different thing with track power. JT kind of touched on it. You know, when those trains are running continuously, the brass track that he replaced a couple of years ago had been up there for 15 years, and they were getting slivers of brass coming off of the corners. And it just wore the track down right down to the web. So that was all replaced. But one of the other things that we have down there, so you can go to the next slide. We have actually 7 different trolley lines running continuously along with the 4 loops. And the trolleys are just going back and forth, and you know, we do fun stuff with the trolleys. You know, they're kind of whimsical, or we might actually have something more prototypical. We just completed kind of a model of our short line down there, the Meeker Southern. So we painted up a locomotive and a caboose just exactly like theirs, and we've got it running back and forth on like a little mock-up of the line between Sumner and Fording down there. So I hadn't really had any experience with the controllers that actually make the thing go back and forth, and so this was it was an interesting exercise. When I started down there last year in September, JT brought up a few of the little quirks, the things that weren't working quite right or just had a question about, and one of them was the trolleys. And so this one you probably recognize, that's kind of a traditional trolley that Bachmann makes. Next slide. And people probably for sure know what an egg liner looks like. You could run an egg liner around in a loop, or you can have it go back and forth. Usually we do these, we've got a few egg liners. We'll run those on our back and forth trolley lines. And different themes. We've got, you know, one for Halloween and different stuff like that. Okay, next slide. So the trolley car itself, like I said, you could run that in a continuous loop, or you can do back and forth. In order to get it to go back and forth, so that it is, you know, not something you have to keep messing with, they make automatic reversing units that actually slow it down, reverse the polarity. Of course, it's running on track power, so you got to reverse the polarity so it'll go back the other direction, and then it's got to somehow figure out that it's at that end of the track and then stop it and reverse the polarity. And so, you know, for 9 hours, our 7 trolleys are going back and forth every day, 7 days a week. So they get a lot of wear and tear too. This is going to be, I'm going to be talking about these controllers and some of the interesting things that we found out and we had to do with those things. So next slide. So this was something, this was a puzzler for us for several months, and me being an electrical engineer, I took on this challenge. So there's an NMRA standard, S9, that was came out in August of '84, that it says in their standard that the positive polarity on the right-hand rail will make the train go forward. So you look at the track there, if the plus terminal, or if the plus voltage is on the right-hand rail, the train is going to go to the right. Well, interestingly enough, most of the G-scale stuff you buy does not conform to that standard. So, you know, I guess they, when they came up with the G-scale stuff over in LGB, I think was one of the original makers of this stuff, they didn't follow that standard. So, if you, you know, kind of look at this and you think, well, okay, if we've got to make it work correctly, how do they actually design these reversing units? Because it's got to be the correct direction, otherwise it's just going to keep going off the end of the track. So, next slide. There we go. Okay, so there's several manufacturers of these automatic reversers. Piko is one of them. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Is that right? I've never heard anybody say exactly which way to pronounce it, but and then another one we discovered is Scale Graphics. They're a little bit newer to the game and a little less expensive than the Piko unit. And then the next slide, Aristocraft also made these. Of course, they're not in business anymore, but interestingly enough, we've got, what, 2 of those down there at the cannery, and they've been working flawlessly for years.
And if I cannot, if anybody's got one, let me know, because you can't get these, and they just work.
Yeah, yeah. So, next slide. So these reversing units, basically the ones that we've dealt with down there might be other varieties, but the ones that we have down there, there's kind of 2 basic ways they do this. And it's with or without a diode at the end of the track. And so the ones that use the diode, actually both styles have a gap or an insulated rail joiner at each end. And the difference between the ones with the diodes and without, if it's got a diode on the end and both diodes are pointing in the same direction, I've got another picture coming up, but basically the train will run in one direction until it gets down to the end where it's insulated there and the diode is facing the direction that it's going. And so there's not going to be any power on that rail that's got the insulated joint on the end. So the train's going to come to a stop there. Then when the polarity reverses, now the diode allows voltage to get to that insulated section, and then the train will go back the other direction. And of course, with the diodes both pointing the same way, when it gets to the other end of the track, that end of the track doesn't have power on one rail. So it just kind of goes back and forth. Now, as you can imagine, when it's in that center section, which just has power running into it the traditional way, when it hits that insulated joint, if there's no power on that one rail, it's just going to come to a lurching stop, which isn't really great for the locomotive or for realistic. So the controllers have gotten a little more sophisticated where they start slowing it down to start reducing the voltage before it hits that rail joint. And I'll tell you how it does that in a minute here. So next slide. Okay, here's a little bit more detail on, this is the Piko one here. As you can see, there's the blue and the red lines coming in are wires coming from that reverser. And so the A and the B up there, those are the wires going to the center section of the track that gets power all the time. And then the C and D, those 2 wires, those are on the insulated ends, the isolated parts of the track on those rails at each end. And so the controller, when the locomotive, say we're heading to the right side of the picture there, as soon as the locomotive hits the insulated section there, the controller can sense that it's drawing current from that section of track, and it knows that now it needs to start reducing the voltage. So at the moment you start drawing current through that wire that's connected to the C terminal there, it's going to start reducing the voltage down. And usually they have some adjustments in there so that you can have it come to gradual stop. And then it will basically drop it down to 0. It'll reverse the polarity for you, and then it'll back it up. And you notice that we've got 4 wires connected to our complete track assembly here, and there's no diodes there. So the controller's doing the whole thing based on what it's sensing. Okay, next slide. That Piko reverser, interestingly, the relays that are inside that box, and so I've got the cover off of that one there. You probably can't read it, but the relay says that it's rated at 3 amps, the contacts in there. And one of the things that was happening when I started working down there was we had some of these Piko reversers, and it would work for a while, for a week or so, and then it would just stop running. And JT said, well, if I take a little bar and tap on the box, it starts working again. I said, well, that's interesting. So well, I wonder why physically, if you tap on the box, why would that get it to work again? Well, the only thing I could come up with was those relays are just barely rated for what we're doing with a G-scale locomotive. Now, I don't know why Piko wouldn't make them heavier duty, but maybe they figured that they'd still work. But so what I did is I took the relays off of the circuit board, and we found a place to buy like a package of these relays, which weren't very much. They were maybe 50 cents a piece or something. And I put sockets on the circuit board so that I could take the relay off of there and replace it. So as soon as I replaced it with fresh relays, voila, it works. And I think it's still been working for like 4 or 5 months now. So I think just the constant back and forth, 9 hours a day, 7 days a week, you know, it's just, I don't know if they were made to cycle that many times. Maybe if you just are running it on the weekend for an hour or two, be fine. But, you know, like JT said, we're running our Consumer Reports durability testing down there on this stuff. So so that kind of solved that problem with that reverser. So we were happy that we didn't have to go buy another $200 plus reverser just because it wasn't working. So now we can just throw a new relay on there and it'll work. Next slide. So I mentioned that NMRA standard with the polarity on the rails. So another puzzler we had was some of our stuff would work on a trolley line with these reversers, and some of them wouldn't. You know, they get to the end, and the thing would it'd run into our bumper, and it'd still be running, and it'd be just sitting there running, and it wouldn't go back. Well, that's weird. What's going on here? So that's when I started looking into this issue, and lo and behold, the egg liners on the bottom have a switch. It says NMRA standard and large scale. So, that's curious. So, it when it's set to the NMRA standard on this egg liner, and you put it on a track with those reversers, it just goes right off the end and it won't stop. But if you put it on large scale, voila, it works. So the reverser is set up for a specific polarity, and it's got to be able to sense when it gets to the end of the track. Well, if you've reversed it on it, then it doesn't know what to do. So that was an interesting little exercise that we figured out. So if you're running an egg liner and you wanted to have it go back and forth with one of these controllers, you got to put it on the large scale switch setting. Okay, next slide. So now the G-Scale Graphics and the Aristocraft reversers, they have a diode, like I said, at each end. And the insulated part of the rail is actually on the same side versus the Piko, those insulated ones, if you remember, it was on opposite rails at each end. So like I said, the diodes, if you can see that, the diodes let current run one direction, basically the way it's pointing from plus to minus. And with these type of reversers, you notice there's only 2 wires going to the whole setup. And so that's kind of curious, because you think, well, how on earth is the power going to get to that insulated section if there's no wire even going to it? Well, that's what the diode does. So when the train is running to the right, and since we're not NMRA standard, if it's going to the right, the left rail or the top rail in that picture is going to be the plus, and the bottom's going to be minus. And so as it's going to the right, that diode, because it has a negative polarity on the left side of that diode as you're looking at it, that one's reverse biased, and so the diode's going to block the current from going through there. So that means that that little insulated section over to the right there is not going to have any voltage, so it's going to come to a stop at the end there. And then once the polarity reverses, now you've got plus on the bottom rail and minus on the top. Now you've got that diode is forward biased, and it's going to allow the voltage to come back, and then the train will go back to the left. Okay, next slide. So this is the G-Scale graphics. We decided to buy a couple of these to try them out. They've actually got, if I can see it here, their relay I believe is rated at 5 amps, which looked like it would be better for us. And it's a little trickier because they do run the diodes at each end, but the diode isolated section is really there for safety, because as you notice, when you've got power to the track and you're going toward the end where there's no power on that one rail, you're not going to go past there no matter what. So it's really a safety device. And what G-Scale Graphics has done is they've based the back and forth on a time basis. And so you tell it how long you want the train to run, like in the, what do they call that, the run one direction. So say it's 5 seconds, so you have it 5 seconds, then it starts, at the end of the 5 seconds, it just starts decreasing the voltage automatically for you. So it's not based on where that gap is in the rail joint, it's based on time. And so this took a little bit of, we're still kind of tweaking with these things. I don't know if I'm totally sold on the idea, but you can basically have it start slowing down before it hits that end gap, and then it'll come to a gradual stop, and it'll just barely get into that gap, and then it'll wait for a little while, which is also adjustable, and then it'll back up and it'll go the other direction. So we're giving it the torture test. We'll see how these things work for us. Next slide. Like I said, the Aristocraft one, man, those things are bulletproof. Whatever they did, I haven't had it apart, but it sure works like a champ. And they also use diodes, same idea, but because it's that time adjustment that you see there, that's just how long it waits before it reverses. So this one is not based on time as far as how long it'll run and then start slowing down. So on the tracks that this setup is installed on, whatever we're running on that track, it will come to a pretty abrupt stop as soon as it hits that gap. So we don't run them very fast. They just kind of run to the end and stop, and then they'll sit there for a few seconds and they'll turn around and head back the other way. Okay, next slide. So like JT said, we run USA Train stuff down to Cannery. One of the unique things about the USA Trains motor units is the pickups that come from the shoes and also from the wheels. They come out to what are on the right-hand side there. I don't have a picture of the end of it, but you can see them on some of our examples up here. They've got 4 pins that come out of the motor case there. And I'll probably get this wrong, I think it's the outside pins go to the motor, is that right, JT?
Yes.
Yep. And then the inside set of pins come from your pickups that go to the rail. And so if you just take and put a connector that kind of shorts those two together, then you've basically got just a free rolling, or a motor that's completely isolated that'll run all by itself. You don't have to have a locomotive on top of it. You don't have to have a switch or anything. You just turn track voltage on and it'll go. And so we've been using these things for, and I think I've got a picture of it coming up later. Yep. If you've got basically this little trolley motor thing that can run back and forth, now you can mount anything you want to on there. So we've got one that pulls a track cleaning, scrub pad behind it, and you name it, we've got it. So, and we call that a bypass because we basically bypassed the locomotive motherboard, and we're just bypassing it and bringing it right in there. So if you go to the next slide, that's actually a trolley. So JT is our creative genius behind all this stuff. I don't take any credit for any of this stuff. That big cloud behind our sign, that's spray foam. I think he buys that by the case too, just to make things out of. But you can see the little USA Trains motor sticking out underneath there. And so those things run great, going back and forth. That was one of the other challenges with that polarity business was that USA Trains motor, because it's not set up as the NMRA standard, they will, if you just take it like it is right out of the box and you put it on a trolley line with these reversers and you try it, it won't work. It'll go to the end and it'll just keep running. And we thought, man, why is that? Why won't that thing work? And so we puzzled around with that for a while, and that's if it's bypassed. So if you think about how this thing is sitting underneath a locomotive, so the forward truck will be this way, and the backward truck will be the same thing but spun back around. So you've got these two guys basically opposite, but they're both going the same way with the locomotive. So, you've got to think about that for a minute. You'd think that if you took this and you apply power, it's going to go this way, and then if you spin it around, if you apply power, it's going to go that way, but it doesn't. It goes the same way. So, in order to get these to work on a trolley line, when we've got them bypassed, we had to take the motor out, and it's just sitting in a little cradle inside there. We take it out, spin it around 180 degrees and drop it back in there. Now it'll work on a trolley line because we've reversed the polarity of the power going into the motor. So that one took me a few months to figure that one out. So, but we did it. So basically that's it. So any questions?
So the Piko one was the only one that kind of slowed down when it hits the other end and switches?
The G-Scale Graphics does too. So when you set the time so that it will start slowing down before it hits the gap, then it'll come to a nice gradual stop, and then it'll go the other way. And so you have to just keep tweaking those potentiometers in there to get the time right, based on the length of your track.
So the Aristocraft's the only one that didn't do the slow down.
Right, yeah, the Aristocraft just comes to abrupt halt, just boom, it's done. And it goes back, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Have you ever used the putting a couple, 2 or 3 diodes in series to slow the speed down in a section of track just before you get to the end?
Haven't tried that, no.
And going one way, you'll have like 3 or 4 diodes. 0.6 of a volt drop on each diode slows the train down for that section of track.
Oh, yeah.
But when you go the other direction, you have just a single diode going the opposite direction across the other 4 or 5 diodes.
Okay.
It'll be full speed as it leaves.
Interesting. Okay, so the diodes that are slowing it down are on one rail, and then the one that actually does reversing is on the other rail?
No.
Nope.
Same rail.
Oh, same rail, okay.
Because you have to just look at, all you're doing is you're just changing the voltage on that
Yeah.
one rail.
Yep,
And
yep.
so-
So you gotta have a bunch of little gaps there as you hit the end of the tracks.
Yeah, so the one I did the cloud on, I just did another diode in the middle, so it was like a depot stop. So it would stop whatever time, and then it would just keep going. It wouldn't, so it'd stop in the middle, then wait to the end, and then, so I had like 3 diodes on that series, or,
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, Bob, just since a lot of people are battery powered, Scale Graphics makes a reversing unit for battery powered trolley. And it works off
Okay.
of magnets.
Oh.
It works off of magnets.
oh, okay.
And just letting people know you can get that from Scale Graphics
Okay.
Yeah, I
for
was
a
just gonna
battery
ask.
powered truck.
Yep.
I was just gonna ask.
Good
if
to
you
know,
could-
yeah.
I was just gonna ask if you could do battery powered trolleys, cause one of my neighbors wants to get a trolley and he's battery powered. He
Yeah,
couldn't
if
make
it goes
it
to
today.
Scale Graphics, they have a reversing unit.
Awesome. Thanks, Chuck.
Yeah, the G-Scale Graphics is a little less expensive too. The Piko, I think, is the most expensive one. But, yeah.
Well, we did do the split jaw one,
Right.
and that was like $250, but we had a lot of problems, and that was, I think, 3 amps. I kept blowing the fuse on that, so.
Yeah. All right. Great, thank you.
Thanks, Bob, thanks, JT. By the way, who's running the trains while you guys are both here?
They run by themselves.
Cool. Well, it's time for a little break. Be on time, so we can have a good day. So we're gonna start out with Norm.